Yeah, this is section 5.6 of the pre-algebra textbook. Starts on page 411, and it's discussing equations with decimals. So you've done some equation work with integers. Now you're going to do equation work with decimals. No big deal, same rules apply. So on page 411, the first example is x minus 1.35 equals negative 2.6. X minus 1.35 equals negative 2.6. So the point of solving an equation is to isolate the variable. We want to get the x by itself. We notice that there is a minus 1.35 or negative 1.35 hanging out with x. To undo that, we're going to add 1.35 to both sides. So we cancel out those, and we notice we have a 2.6 and a 1.35. Now it's not just a 2.6, it's a negative 2.6. So you got to turn your brain on and think about if I have a negative and a positive and I'm going to add them together, I'm actually finding the difference between the two. So 2.6 minus 1.35, I'm finding the difference of their absolute values. So I'm going to need to put a placeholder when I line these up. I have 2.60 over 1.35, lining them up on the decimal, place value to place value. I'm actually going to find the difference between these two. So I have to do some basic subtraction with some borrowing. And I notice that the answer is 1.25. Then I have to think to myself, is my answer going to be positive or negative? And I look back at my original add-ins, and my negative 2.6 is there's more negatives than my positive 1.35. So my answer is still going to be negative. So the final answer is negative 1.25. If I check my answer and plug that answer back in for my x, I would have negative 1.25 minus 1.35. Does that equal negative 2.6? Well, I know now I have two negatives here hanging out together. I'm going to add them together, and sure enough, I get negative 2.6, and that equals negative 2.6. So you're still practicing your skills with decimals. Now we're putting negative numbers in the mix and solving simple equations. So that's using our additive inverse. If you had a division problem like example 2, where you have x over negative 0.35 equals 4.2, x over negative 0.35 equals 4.2, that's actually saying x divided by negative 0.35 equals 4.2. To undo division, we multiply by the same, don't we? We're going to multiply by negative 0.35 on both sides. So we're going to have to take that 4.2 and multiply it by negative 0.35. So let's just multiply 42 times 35, and then we'll bring the decimal back into play. We also know that if it's a positive times a negative, that our final product is going to be negative. So 5 times 2 is 10, carry the 1. 5 times 4 is 20, plus 1 is 21. Placeholder, 3 times 2 is 6, and 3 times 4 is 12. I'm going to add those products together. And then I'm going to go back to my original factors, and I have 1 place, 2 places, 3 places that I need to move my decimal to the left. 1, 2, 3. So I have 1.470. I don't really need the 0. And I know that my answer has to be negative 1.47, okay, because I had a positive times a negative. So you're practicing the multiplication skill again that you learned in previous sections, and then you're applying your positive and negative rules to it and doing an equation. So that was if we see division, we want to undo it with multiplication. Then in example 3, it shows negative 1.2x equals negative 4.08. Negative 1.2x equals negative 0 or negative 4.08. So we know to isolate x, we have to undo this negative 1.2 sitting right next to x, multiplying it. So to undo multiplication, we have to do division, don't we? So we're going to need to divide both sides by negative 1.2. When we know a negative divided by a negative, our answer is going to be positive. So we can just ignore those negatives now. We can set up our long division, 4.08 divided by 1.2. And then we have to tap into our rules for division of decimals, and we know we need to change our divisor to a whole number. So I'm going to move my decimal one place to the right on the 1.2 and make it 12. If I move my decimal one place to the right on my divisor, I have to move it one place on to the right on my dividend. So I really have 12 into 40.8, right? 12 into 40.8. So I put my decimal up top in my quotient area, and then I start doing the division. So 12 goes into 8 3 times. I subtract 36 and I get a 4. 12 goes into 40, I think I just said, not 48. 12 goes into 40 3 times. 3 times 12 is 36. Subtract 36 from 40, I get a 4. Pull down my 8, and 12 goes into 48 4 times. And that terminates, doesn't it? So x equals 3.4, or 3 4/10. If we checked our answer, we could plug 3.4 back in for x, multiply it times negative 1.2. We're going to get a negative answer, and the math should work out that we get negative 4.08. You could check that on your calculator. So to undo multiplication, you have to do the division, all right? Then it takes it a step further on page 412. Those are all one-step operations. So now we're going to do a two-step. So we have negative 3.8x minus 1.7 equals negative 17.28. So we want to get x by itself. So we're going to have to undo a couple of things. You learned how to do this with your integers. Now we're just using it with decimals. The process is still the same. So if we want to do the simplest thing first, and the simplest thing to undo would be the negative 1.7 or the minus 1.7. So we're going to add 1.7 to both sides. 1.7 to both sides. Oops, not 1.75, 1.7. All right. So we know that that's going to cancel out. So we have negative 17.28 plus 1.7. That actually means we find the difference between these two numbers, but we keep it negative, doesn't it? So I do a placeholder. I go 8 minus 0 is 8. 2 minus 7, I'm going to need to borrow for that. 12 minus 7 is 5. And then 16 minus 1 is 15. And I'm going to keep it negative because there was more negatives with the negative 17.28 than there was positives with the 1.7. That's going to equal, then I pull down that negative 3.8x. So now one step is done. Still got to get x by itself. So I have negative 3.8x equals negative 15.58. The negative 3.8 is multiplying itself times x, so we're going to divide to undo that, aren't we? So we're going to divide both sides by negative 3.8. So that'll cancel and we'll get x by itself. And now we got to do some long division. That negative 15.58 divided by negative 3.8, we know that it's going to be a positive answer. So we're just going to write out 15.58 divided by 3.8. We got to move our decimal one place to the right on our divisor to make it 38. So then we have to move it one place on the dividend to the right to make it 155.8. So you can rewrite that 155.8 divided by 38. And then you can do the division on that. Place your decimal point up top. How many times does 38 go into 155? That would be 4 times. 4 times 38, 120, 152. And we subtract that and we're left with a 3. You pull down the 8 and 38 goes into 38 once. So it terminates, doesn't it? We have 38 minus 38 is 0. So x equals 4.1. You could check it if you wanted to plug it back in and do negative 3.8 times 4.1. Subtract 1.7 and you should end up at negative 17.28. You could use your calculator for that. So there's a two-step process that you're used to doing with your whole numbers or your integers. Now you're doing it with decimals. You still use additive inverse, you still use multiplicative inverse, but now you're using all your decimal principles, so it's having you practice that addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, and remembering your positive and negative number rules. All right, then on page 412 on to page 413, it talks about combining like terms. So remember, we can combine companies, right? We can combine X's, we can combine Y's, we can combine A's or B's, but we have to combine them only with each other. So X's go with X's, Y's go with Y's, A's go with A's, B's go with B's. So example 5 has negative 3.2x plus 1.16x. So we know we can combine these because they're both x's. So we're going to have a negative 3.2 and a positive 1.16. That means we actually have to find the difference between 3.2 and 1.16. So we subtract 1.16 from 3.2. You're going to do that subtraction algorithm, and you get 2.04, but remember that it needs to be negative because there are more negative 3.2 than the positive 1.16. And then your final answer would be negative 2.04x. Don't forget to bring down the variable that they share as a like term. So that's combining like terms. And you will practice that throughout in 5.6. So just pay attention to those terms. And then also you will use the distributive property. That's on page 414. If you see something like example 7 on page 414, negative 6.3x minus 0.4, open paren, x minus 1.2, close paren, you know that you need to distribute the negative 0.4 to the x and the negative 1.2 in the parens. So you're going to end up with negative 6.3x minus 0.4x plus 0.48, because negative times negative is positive, and then you're going to do the math. 4 times 12 is 48, and you got to move the decimal 2 places over. And you could do it in Scratchwork or do it in your head. Then notice that we can combine our x's. Negative 6.3x and negative 0.4x gives us negative 6.7x plus 0.48. All right, and that then shows that we're using the distributive property and combining like terms. And then the equation went on to say it was equal to something. It was equal to negative 0.86, and I didn't write that up there originally. But we could make it equal to something, and then now it's a two-step process, isn't it? Solving this equation. We could subtract 0.48 from both sides, right? That cancels out that, and we get negative 6.7x equals a negative 1.34, because we have a negative 0.86 and a negative 0.48. We're going to add those two together and keep it negative. Then we're going to divide by a negative 6.7 on both sides. The 6.7's cancel out, and x is going to equal negative 1.34 divided by negative 6.7. They're going to cancel on the negative, so we know the answer is going to be positive. And then if you do the work or punch it in the calculator, you get 0.2. And at this point, most likely in class also, I'm going to have you have your calculators out and working these with your calculators also. All right? So that's solving using the distributive property. So you're still applying those skills that you've learned before, but now we're just using them with decimals. And then also it brings in rounding again. You know how to do that. And then there are some story problems that are going to utilize decimals in the rest of the section. So again, this section is just about doing equations with decimals. You've already used additive inverse and multiplicative inverse with whole numbers and integers. Now you're just applying them with decimals. It's tedious. It takes some extra effort if you're doing it by hand. You could also have a calculator handy and check your answers with that, or do the problems with the calculator. You still have to go through the same process. Be very careful when you punch in those numbers on the calculator. So that is section 5.6, equations with decimals. Do good thinking.